ago at Wahpeton High, and so we were just reminiscing a little bit. I'm going to introduce her, and then she's going to talk to you. So that's basically the lineup. All right. After fleeing her home country of Azerbaijan, Anna and her family spent 3 rough years in Armenia before coming to Wahpeton as refugees. During this time, the USSR went through extreme chaos as the Soviet Union republics began their fight for independence, and many of you probably know that from history. She graduated from Wahpeton High School and from the University of North Dakota with bachelor's degrees in English, philosophy, and religion. She went on to earn her Juris Doctor at the University of Maine School of Law. Anna started her diary at the age of 10 while they were in Baku at the urging of her grandmother. The diary was kept for 3 years and was brought to the U.S. In 1992, soon after coming to North Dakota, Anna started writing her book at the age of 14, finishing it at the age of 16. It was intended to be a record of the family's history for future children and grandchildren, but in 2012, Anna published the book at the urging of the Armenian community in the U.S. Recently, she was the recipient of the Hitar Gash Medal, the Armenian government's highest civilian honor that is awarded for notable state, public, and political activities, as well as significant services in the areas of diplomacy, law, and political science. Anna and her family live in Maine, and she is here. Please help me welcome Anna.
Thank you, Sybil. I do remember that art class. Good afternoon. My name is Anna Astvatsaturian Turcotte. I would like to begin by thanking NDSCS Cultural Diversity Council and Mildred Johnson Library for inviting me and hosting me here today. I also want to thank all of you in the audience for your interest in my book and my personal experience as a refugee from Baku. Almost 22 years ago, my parents, my brother and I left Moscow and flew into JFK International Airport in New York City. We had 4 suitcases, $180, and a refugee status. That is all we needed. This was the beginning of the future. A future bright and peaceful, where belonging to a place is not unthinkable. Where your children can gain anything you want without fear or apprehension of being discovered Armenian. My story is not unique. It is like so many other stories of fellow Armenian refugees who fled Azerbaijan in fear for their lives. The only difference, I believe, is that I kept a diary. And upon coming to the United States at the age of 13, I had an overwhelming and powerful urge to translate it and write down vivid memories for my future children. Indeed, they would be American, I thought of them, in a community homes apartment we first called home here in Wahpeton. My future children, I thought, needed to know their roots and never forget our sacrifices and the story of Baku Armenians who suffered so much. I was determined, deeply affected by our move here. I started writing by hand at 14 years old, finishing my scribbles at 16. It was always meant to stay within our family. I tucked the book away into my closet for 20 years, until I was persuaded to publish it by the Armenian community on the East Coast. I am Armenian, and I was born in Azerbaijan, one of 15 Soviet republics. My childhood was happy, sunny, and colorful. Living in Baku, a city of 2 million people, was a blessing in many ways. Baku was a warm and vibrant, gorgeous, multicultural city of 2 million on Caspian Sea, with beautiful fountains, buildings, statues, with artists, musicians, scientists, and doctors of all nationalities living together safely. My parents had friends who were Azeris, Russians, Armenians, Greeks, and Jews. I attended a prestigious school with a rigorous English program, went to ballet classes and volleyball practices. We were surrounded by hundreds of relatives, went to the beach, celebrated birthdays and weddings, and buried our loved ones together. My grandfather, Yevgeny, my father's father, was a well-known chef in Baku. An entire city respected him and knew his name. He came to Baku as a young man after World War II in search for work from the neighboring Armenian Republic, starting our family history in Azerbaijan. My parents were born in Baku. My cousins, my brother, and I were born in Baku. Hundreds of my relatives called Baku home. But despite this peace, Armenians who loved Baku, our home, knew their place. When I was born, my parents decided against naming me Anush, after both of my great-grandmothers, a very Armenian name, and instead called me Anna, a neutral, international version. Grandfather Yevgeny knew of the horrors that may exist against Armenians from the early massacres that followed Armenian genocide in 1915, when 1.5 million Armenians were slaughtered by Turks. The genocide stretched out to Baku in 1918, targeting Armenians and other Christians. He survived this Armenian genocide as a toddler. That is why he took the family last name ending Yan and russified it to protect us. We were no longer Astvatsaturian, we were now Astvatsaturians, a Russian version. Little did he know that this change in the 1940s would help save us when the storm of hatred came over us in 1988, 10 years after he passed away. The tensions were created by the history of the region and magnified by the Soviet government. A few decades before my grandfather moved to Armenia permanently, in the early 1920s, Stalin became the country's leader and implemented the divide and conquer policy in the region to keep the tensions high. He did this by cutting out the ancient Armenian region called Nagorno-Karabakh, with all its Armenian residents, and handed it over to Azerbaijan as an autonomous region. The Soviet rule, powerful and unrelenting, offered stillness and peace to the region. It was artificially imposed, but it was real for the everyday moments of life. But in the late 1980s, things began to change. As the Soviet Union began its gradual and enormous collapse, the republics of the Union asserted their independence. Nagorno-Karabakh also asserted its independence from Azerbaijan, holding peaceful and lawful referendums, and began to push to rejoin Armenia some 70 years later. That is why, in February of 1988, the life as we knew it, for myself, my family, and hundreds of our friends, ceased to exist. I was 10 years old. The government of Azerbaijan began the propaganda of hatred to unite the everyday citizens against their neighbors. First it was the city of Sumgait, then Kirilabad, then the capital, Baku. Thugs stormed our streets and attacked us for simply being Armenian. My school was constantly raided, the rioters looking for Armenian students, who often hid under our desks. My neighborhood was constantly attacked, and we were living in the dark, with windows shut, waiting out the storm. We were reliving the nightmare my grandfather endured some 70 years later. The Azeris were enraged to lose the region, taking the hatred and anger out on our Armenian population of Azerbaijan. The riots would cease, then resume, then cease, then resume, each time escalating. Sometimes Russian forces arrived during the unrest, but they were only there to make sure the Azeris knew who was in control, Moscow, not to protect us. Sometimes Russian forces returned to prevent the rioters and demonstrators from burning campfires on Lenin Square, marble and pavement that left dark circles all around the center of the city, not to protect us. The concrete and rock were more important to the Soviet forces than our human lives. We lived in constant fear of violence. My mother was hoping for a resolution so life would go back to normal as it was for the last 70 years. She was reluctant to uproot a lifelong home of my parents and my grandparents. My mother was 35 years old with 2 children. Now, as a mother of 2, and also 35, I cannot fathom the fear and uncertainties she lived with daily. Not only was I confused as a child, watching the sudden surge of violence around me against innocent Armenians, but my parents were confused as well. This cannot be happening in this day and age, my parents often said. My grandmother, a very wise woman, told me to start keeping a diary, because things like this don't happen every day, and you must never forget. This diary eventually became my book. Moving within the Soviet Union was nearly impossible. You had to get state permission to move and to work in a region outside of your place of birth. As the situation escalated, my parents started looking at options, even though my mother was still in denial that people were killing Armenians in the 20th century Soviet Union. The months spent surrounded by Russian tanks never offered any protection. My family, along with neighbors, often brought Russian troops across the street food in hopes they would protect us when Azeris came for us. But they told us they had strict orders not to interfere. We never knew when we would be attacked, when the riots against us would resume. When thousands of Armenians died in the 1988 earthquake in Armenia, we received festive cards of congratulations from random Azeri citizens congratulating us on the deaths of Armenians. Going to school became terrifying. My face and my name became terrifying. I look very Armenian. Even now, as a grown adult and American citizen, living in safety, when I came across Azeri's speech for the first time in 21 years in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol Hill event I was invited to, my instant inherent reaction was to hide my face down and to the left. I had to watch my father arm himself with kitchen knives and an axe, time and time again, as we shut off our lights and close our curtains, hiding in the dark. We were waiting out the storm of demonstrations going by our living room window almost daily. I witnessed violence and the intolerance toward innocent Armenians with my own eyes and with my own body, the body of a child. My neighborhood childhood friend lost his mother to the violence, and his grandmother was severely beaten, left to bleed in front of her 11-year-old grandson. She eventually died of her injuries 2 years later, and of a broken heart to lose her daughter in this way. My uncle was bruised and bloody, barely surviving, trying to retrieve items from his house when he was ambushed by gangs of thugs. My mother's maiden name was Adamian, and the very first alphabetically on a list when the list that the government provided when the thugs came to our neighborhood looking for Armenians. Luckily, we left 2 months prior. This was no longer our home. This was a place we had to leave behind along with hundreds of thousands of others. 300,000 Armenians of Baku alone. Some left bruised, beaten with nothing in the middle of the night in the nightgowns, boarding ships to nowhere. Others left hurriedly to distant places, away from everything they knew and everyone they loved. We didn't just lose our belongings, our homes, and our security. So many Armenians lost their lives. The Armenian church in the center of Baku, the church I treasured visiting as a child, was set ablaze. The graves of my grandparents, Yagishe and Tamar in Baku, are no longer there because they were demolished, as were all Armenian cemeteries in Azerbaijan. We fled Baku for our lives. The only place that we could go was Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. Armenia was a magical place for me, a place my family often described in stories of beautiful churches, 1,700-year-old churches, mountains, music, and delicious fruit. One of the very first places we visited was Echmiadzin, which is the Armenian Vatican. My family, especially my little brother, was personally blessed by Catholicos Vasile I, the great Catholicos of all Armenians. We were comforted by the experience, and I was personally touched by his warmth and presence at such an impressionable age. But Armenia was far from the ideal place with its recent problems. The horrific 1988 earthquake that demolished 3 major cities created floods of refugees which came to Yerevan for assistance. Blockade cut off Armenia from fuel and so many provisions needed for the everyday survival of the people. Armenia was now in war with Azerbaijan over the Karabakh region. Baku Armenians lived in theaters, old prisons, abandoned buildings, and empty factories. My family and I were lucky. We lived in a cold stone cellar, 5 by 5, of a distant relative's house, and made it our home for nearly 3 years. There was no heat. We heated with scraps off the street. There was no running water. We bathed in the outdoor bathroom facility once a week. And here comes the most difficult part, surprisingly. All the physical discomfort, such as freezing conditions, hunger, lice, pain of undersized clothes and shoes, paled in comparison to the sting and disappointment I felt in the people I idealized all of my life, the Armenians of Armenia. The intolerance of native Armenians toward us, Wahpeton as they called us, was the last and final blow to our struggle. We were blamed for the war that now erupted, for the empty store shelves, for the blockade, for the overcrowding, for the cold temperatures. We were not wanted. We were dirty refugees. We were called traitors for missing our home, Turks for not speaking the language. The Muslim must have rubbed off on you, I often heard in school. We were the second-rate citizens. Many refugees had a far more positive experience from the local and the rural areas, but life in that busy Yerevan was rough for my family and friends. It was traumatic to be treated this way by our own people after just witnessing such violence and fear in Baku. My parents tried to ignore the intolerance. They were ecstatic we were safe. And they also understood about the dire situation of the country more than I did as a child. So disappointed not to be accepted by my own people. All of us suffered together because the changes were enveloping the entire Soviet Union were colossal. The Republic of the Union, 15 of them, were going through their own scary and unpredictable process of independence. Everything was changed and we had nowhere to go. Life in the rotting basement in Yerevan was unbearable, with no future in sight. And the light at the end of this dark 3-year-old tunnel was America. We first flew into New York after the 12-hour anxious wait in the Moscow airport. Until the very last minute there, we were unsure if we could leave. Then Minneapolis, then Fargo. It was dead of winter on January 31st to February 1st, 12 a.m., 1992. When we stepped outside of the airport, my 7-year-old brother, Michael, was disappointed there were no skyscrapers. This is America after all. And my father said, laughing, "We fled the Soviets and they sent us to America's Siberia." We were cold, but we were safe. The community was quick in embracing us. We were sponsored by an Armenian Methodist church. Our first exposure to American life, per the instructions of a government psychologist, I'm sure, was to take us to Econo Foods. I have never in my life seen apples that were so perfect. Boxes of cereal so plentiful, even in the good times and Baku. I have never seen so much food in one place. The community that welcomed us was kind and willing to help. For months we were driven to doctor appointments, English lessons, and immigration offices to fill out our paperwork. I started 8th grade at the middle school in mid-February. The school was warm, new, clean, and shiny, far from the devastated, cold, overwhelmed school that I left in Yerevan. But with the good came the bad. At the time, there were no programs for refugees. I believe we were the second family to arrive here. I, at 14 years old, helped my parents with their taxes. I remember at 14 having nightmares about translating for my parents. English classes were few and far in between, and there were no certified English as second language programs here. We were taught English, but I don't think that, I think it would have taken my parents much quicker if there were programs in Wahpeton. And I'm so happy to learn that there's so many different programs available in Florida, Grand Forks, and Wahpeton area right now. It wasn't an easy adjustment to life, different in every way you can just about imagine. One thing is clear, however: we are proud Armenians who do not depend on anyone, including the government. All my parents wanted to find a job was to find a job, and that was nearly impossible because they didn't speak any English. But 6 months later, my father found a job at Primewood. He works there now, 21 years later, and is about to retire in December. My mother worked in various community-based businesses over the last 2 decades as well. My mother received a university degree at one of the best art programs in the Soviet Union, working as an art and drafting teacher at prestigious schools all her adult life. And upon coming to the United States, she had no issues taking on jobs beneath her skills and talents, working toward her children's future. My father was one of the best artists in the country and continues to work on his art, recently receiving the National Bush Foundation Fellowship for his medal refugee, while at the same time working 12-hour shifts at Primewood. In the early 90s, we were donated clothes, and I wasn't cool or popular in high school. But starting with the first $180, my parents saved every penny, and we were able to buy our own home in 2 years. We encountered amazing acts of kindness in Wahpeton, as well as blatant, painful discrimination throughout the years. Unforgettable discrimination. Despite this reality, the good always outweighed the bad in our minds and in our goals, and nothing ever stopped us. We're living in the safest country in the world with freedoms unimaginable to the rest of the world, with unlimited opportunities to make anything you want out of your life. I received an amazing education at Wahpeton High School with mentorships of Mr. John Wall, who's here today. My high school teacher, who pushed me to finish this book. He wasn't just a teacher. He was my rock outside of home to ground me and to push me forward. With our hard work, my brother and I were able to attend the University of North Dakota, and I received a law degree from the University of Maine School of Law, where my brother and I are both professionals and provide for our families and our communities we live in. The standards were always high for us, and nothing was unachievable in this country thanks to my parents. Soon after enrolling in law school, I was lucky to be chosen to participate in the Preparatory Commission of the International Criminal Court at the United Nations in New York City. In 2002, ICC was founded, the first permanent international court to try crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. I was awarded Who's Who Outstanding Law Student of the Year for that very work on the International Criminal Court and the projects I spearheaded in law school. Upon graduating from law school, I was lucky to be the third American to clerk for the International Criminal Court in The Hague. There, within the walls of the very first such institution, I worked with amazing international law scholars and experts on the very issues that made me a refugee. Had that institution existed in 1988, 1989, and 1990, the atrocities against Armenians in Azerbaijan would not have been committed. And if they had been deterred by the existence of the ICC, The crimes would most definitely be punished. Unlike the reality today, no one is punished for their crimes against humanity on the Armenians in my homeland. I completed my clerkship at the ICC and made a decision that my life was waiting back for me in the States. I came back from that amazing historic experience and continued to build my life and career in banking and law in the United States, getting married to the love of my life and having 2 beautiful children. My book would be impossible without the safety and opportunity this country offered me and my family. Writing it was painful. I missed my home. I missed my second home. I had to adjust to my third home. Transition to the U.S. was difficult, and this was in many ways my escape from the past. I wrote it alone in my room while reading through my diary entries to check on the dates and my feelings, using it as a base. I described the details as if I was walking through the events in real time, simultaneously savoring the memories and lovingly reliving my happy childhood home before all hell broke loose. That is why most of my readers tell me they feel like they're reliving it alongside me. They are. I finished it around 16 years old, I showed it to my parents. My father was angry at me. He wanted me to move on and forget, as he was trying to himself. He didn't want me to be in pain and to relive the past. It was too soon for him, and after the very first chapter, he pushed it away. Now, after reading it again 20 years later, he told me the first time he read chapter 1, he was in shock as to how much I understood and internalized at such an early age. During my senior year of high school, I was enrolled in English 101 and 1 or 2 classes here at science school. At the recommendation of Mr. John Wall, I reluctantly showed my book to Ms. Debbie Dusek, who's now retired. She was my instructor. She read it and offered some valuable advice on the piece, but most importantly, for her warmth and humor and genuine interest in an awkward and shy teenager, she offered support to a girl lost and in pain. At UND and in law school, the seed was already planted in my mind that perhaps this was a book someone outside of my family might be interested in reading. Despite the lack of time in law school, I began the process of preparing it for publication with my editor, the great Armenian poet Tatu Sonets Papazian I met in Boston. My father, who was once against it, was fully supporting the idea now, telling me it needed to be done. During this time, I learned that in the years since our arrival, there is no literature on the conflict at all. I was also faced with the fact that the war, although ended in ceasefire, didn't resolve the Karabakh conflict. Karabakh is currently de facto independent, meaning it's dependent in fact, but not in law. No country in the world recognizes Karabakh as an independent entity or country. Despite the lawful referendums and the will of the people by an overwhelming majority of 99% to be free from Azerbaijan, Karabakh has no trade relations with anyone but Armenia. Their kindergartens are shot at by Azeri snipers. Their border soldiers get fired upon at an alarmingly increasing rate. Their newly rebuilt airport was destroyed during the war 20 years ago and was rebuilt recently, threatened by the new Azeri legislation that makes it lawful to shoot civilian aircraft that takes off from that airport. Their children's early education involves learning at an early age as to how to avoid stepping on a mine that is an open-air prison for 150,000 fellow Armenians who are fighting to protect their homeland, threatened with war almost daily. This year, after both Massachusetts and Rhode Island passed state resolutions supporting the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh, I'm happy to report that my husband and I spearheaded and achieved a similar resolution in the state of Maine. This amazing feat was soon followed by a resolution in Louisiana and a declaration of support in a new fledgling democracy in Maryland. Many more states are to follow, and Karabakh will be free. Publishing my book uncensored the way I wrote it at 14 years old was one of the most difficult and most important things I have ever done in my life. I hope it educates people on the covered-up and known acts of ethnic cleansing committed under the world's noses mere 2 decades ago in the Soviet Union. I want to bring awareness to the fact that Karabakh Armenians are still not officially free, but only de facto independent for 2 decades, despite their democratic will and right to self-determination, despite their democratically elected government and peaceful intentions. I hope this book will help revive the conversation and push us toward a peaceful resolution, keeping in mind that there are children that are affected. Children like I was and my friends, children like my children. Judging from my presentations and conversations across this country, from Los Angeles to Philadelphia to North Dakota, this call for Karabakh freedom is starting anew. And finally, I hope it memorializes the suffering of the Armenian refugees from Azerbaijan and speaks for the plight of all refugees in general in the most pure way that I could in my childhood voice. Thank you.